Morning, Facebook. Thank you to everyone who gives me your time. I believe in this project. I believe it's going to help other people, but at the end of the day, you're giving me your time and helping me, so greatly appreciate it. The last video that I made on Thursday, and it's now Saturday, was about how the forearm and the wrist and how you align them in the center of the range of motion, why, and then what their ranges of motion are, and how to feel the muscular exertion as you take them in and out of the center of the range of motion and then bring them back to it. Today we're going to tie that to how the whole arm has an impact along with gravity in aligning the wrist and forearm. And what we're going to cover is what are called right hand displacement types, which are how you move the hand and fingers above and to the strings. And for those of you who are classical guitar dorks, that's vocabulary I stole from Carl Lavaro, and what I believe he's trying to say in any way. And then after we talk about the right hand displacement types, we're going to talk about sitting position and how that is shaped, how the right hand displacement type that you use is shaped by the sitting position you choose. And then we're going to talk about the forearm and the wrist and how that alignment is affected by gravity. And then we're going to talk about tying all that together by aligning with gravity with the two displacement type tools. And then we're going to talk about the last part, which is once you've done all that, what do you have to do with the wrist itself in order to maintain an alignment? Because there is a little bit of just wrist involved. So the first thing that we're going to cover is the right hand displacement types, which are how you bring the fingers and the hand to the string. Now, there are two tools that are at your disposal to displace the hand, the right hand. One of them is what's called the glenohumeral fossa joint. Because it connects the shoulder to the arm and it's a mouthful, I call it the shoulder to arm joint. I think that's just simpler. And that's a ball and socket joint. You got the ball at the end of the arm and you have the socket in the shoulder. Pop that in there, and because it's a ball and socket, it is a pretty wide range and flexible range of motion. Tool number two is going to be your elbow, which has a more limited range of motion because it basically is like a drawbridge. You got the castle, which is your bicep, and towards the castle, away from the castle, up or down, or in and out, depending on how you want to look at it. So more limited range of motion. There are two displacement types that you can do with the shoulder to arm joint and one with the elbow. For the shoulder to arm joint, you have one where the forearm contact point for the right forearm stays consistent, and I call it the seesaw because you kind of go up and down like a seesaw. The second is where the forearm contact point shifts further or closer away from the wrist and elbow, depending on how you want to look at it. And so as you can see, it goes further or closer away from the wrist or elbow, but you don't see any seesaw. The third displacement type is driven by the elbow, and that's where you go from the treble to the bass strings using the elbow. Now, which one of those displacement types you choose, or that dominates your technique, I should say, because any technique is going to use a little bit of all the displacement types to a certain degree, but one is going to dominate, and it's going to tend to either be the shifting, forearm contact shifting displacement type, or the elbow displacement type. And depending on how you sit and choose to sit, that's going to have an effect on which one tends to dominate. So as an example, if you go back to like the 30s and 40s and 50s and you look at those older guitar players, like Ida Presti, Segovia, Parkening, Lagoya, and flamenco players back then and through the present, you will often see wrist deviation towards the pinky, and then predominantly elbow or elbow right hand displacement. And so you get from the treble to the bass strings just using that elbow motion. And it's kind of intuitive why, because when you're in this position, you can't really go a whole lot further up with that shoulder to arm joint. Now, there are no hard and fast rules. So if you watch Paco de Lucia's technique, a lot of times what you see is he'll go play chords and you'll see a lot of elbow displacement type. But once he shifts towards doing scales and rest stroke, you'll see he'll move it out of position using the shoulder to arm joint here. And not only will he make that shift, but he'll also go from the treble to the bass strings using the shoulder to arm joint. So again, there's no hard and fast rule, but sitting position does tend to influence which technique or which displacement types tends to dominate your technique. Now, if you look at classical guitar over the last 30 years, and you look at the Guitar Federation of America, or the GFA, the #1 most prestigious guitar competition in the world, and you look at those players, the neck angle in relation to the guitar has gone from being more perpendicular of the old school in flamenco to being more elevated. And the reason for that, I think, has to do with the fact that they started to intuit that they could use the forearm contact shifting displacement type more easily when they sat in this position. Now, again, to illustrate the point of how it's sort of complicated, never just using one, if you watch, my elbow is kind of along for the ride, but it is flexing and extending, moving in and out, along with that shoulder to arm joint movement. So you're never just using one of those things. The seesaw displacement type is almost never used in either, and we're going to circle back on why that is, because the next thing I want to talk about is review a little bit of the forearm and wrist stuff we talked about yesterday, or in the last video. And so remember, with the forearm, you can go palm up, you can go palm down, or you can be in the center of its range of motion. With the wrist, you can flex down, you can extend up, or you can deviate towards the pinky or towards the thumb. And in the last video, we went through those ranges of motion, and we taught you how to feel the muscle exertion on this side as an example that comes from pulling it this way, and also the stretching of the other side that comes from stretching those muscles. Just like if you were to pull with your tricep and do a bicep stretch, you'd feel some exertion of the triceps pulling, but you'd also feel some stretching of the bicep itself. Now, the reason the center of the range of motion is a key concept, and for those of you who are classical guitar nerds, I didn't steal this concept exactly from Aaron Shear, but it was influenced by it, because that diagram where he shows the fingers and talks about like center of the range of motion, how far you can go from that, definitely came or was influenced by that. The reason that the center of a joint's range of motion tends to be important is, one, gravity tends to bring it there, and the reason gravity tends to bring it there, point number two, is that you have to think that the body is sort of designed to go to that center of its range of motion, because what's happening is when you're relaxed, as soon as you go to palm down, you're exerting muscles to bring it palm down, and you're stretching muscles on the opposite side. So like the stretched muscles are kind of pulling it in the opposite direction, sort of. It's the simplification of it. So when you relax, they both get to be relaxed. Same when you go in the opposite direction. So it's a combination of gravity impacting on your body, but also your body being designed to sort of sit in a neutral zone, so to speak. And that has to do with those muscles and tendons on either side of the range of motion. Now, I keep talking about gravity, so we need to address that head on. Gravity, so up until now we've talked about muscles being exerted to move. So like when I move the elbow in, it's the bicep, and then the tricep is being stretched. And so you have this muscle exertion and stretching factor. But there's another factor which is external, which is gravity. And gravity, as an example, it explains why you don't see a lot of that seesaw displacement type, because if I just go like this, and then if I hold my wrist in place using wrist muscle, the wrist will stay aligned. But gravity is this external force, and as I seesaw, you're going to see the wrist starts to flex passively because gravity is pushing it down. And so one thing that we want to start to tie together is that we need to think about how these right hand displacement types help us set up the whole arm, and how gravity has an impact on that whole set of circumstances. So when we talk about the wrist, we want to think of that drawbridge analogy, where this is the castle, the chains, the tendons that run from the bicep muscle to the forearm are like the chains to the drawbridge, and the forearm is like the drawbridge. And when you flex the muscle, the drawbridge comes in, and then when you relax it, it goes back out. And that's basically how all muscles work, but there's a catch with the muscles that operate on the fingers. And that is that if you're going to flex the fingers in, or you're going to extend them out, those muscles actually are in the forearm. So for flexing, it's down here. For extending, it's up here. And then those tendons run through the wrists. And the reason that matters is that the wrist, because they run through the wrist and through the wrist carpal tunnel, if you don't do anything with the finger muscles and tendons, but you do move the wrist muscles and the wrist joint, you're going to see that you're going to have an impact on the fingers. And so as you flex the wrist, the fingers are going to spread out and they're going to extend. And then as you extend the wrist, you're going to see the fingers come together and flex. And so when we're thinking about whether we're positioning just with the wrist or using the whole arm and the right hand displacement types, we got to think about how that has an impact on the fingers. And there's also another component to this too, which is that if I were to just play, if I were trying to play and I was constantly moving my wrist and forearm, it's sort of intuitive that I couldn't, there has to be some consistency. Now, there's some flexibility, and the reason for that is that when you flex the wrist or extend the wrist, that has an impact on the fingers, but deviation towards the pinky or thumb does not, which is why that old school technique of like Segovia and Presti and Parkening with that wrist kind of looking like this, as opposed to being straight, it's like this. That's why that works, because the flexion and extension causes problems, but the deviation does not. And so you have a certain amount of flexibility, but what I'm trying to get at here and drive home is that consistency is important. So whether you choose the new school or the old school, if you're moving around constantly, one of the things I'm trying to drive home here is that you're going to run into problems. So part of the reason that we're learning all this stuff is just to learn how to be consistent in our forearm position and wrist position. Now, next thing I want to talk about is aligning the forearm with the right hand display, or aligning the forearm and the wrist with the right hand displacement types and gravity. And so, again, what I kind of want to review here is we need to think about how the right hand displacement types affect the wrist, because as you move, like if I'm like this and then I elbow, you're going to see some wrist deviation towards the pinky. If I do seesaw, you're going to see some wrist flexion and then back to extended to the center of its range of motion. So what I'm trying to get at here is, one, you have to think about how the displacement types that you're doing and the motion that you're doing with those affect the wrist and forearm, because if the wrist and forearm are out of the center of the range of motion, it's going to affect those tendons running through the forearm and the wrist. But the other part of it too is that we also want to try to reach that alignment in the center of range of motion with the least amount of muscular exertion possible. And so we're going to do that by doing some of the work with the right hand displacement types. So the way I would start to learn this is I'd start with your hand and arm like this, with a little bit of passive flexion from gravity of the wrist and a little bit of pinky deviation. And what I'd feel is I'd feel the tension that's here. And I just find that's a really nice place to feel. And at least for me, you might find other areas, and that's why in the last video I sort of taught you the ranges of motion, but this is the way I think about it. So right now what's happening is because gravity's pushing the wrist down from the center of its range of motion, you're feeling some stretching here. And you're gonna feel a lot of that because you're hanging in the air. The next step is to bring the fingers in contact with the strings. And once you do that, you're gonna feel still some tension here because it's not in the center of its range of motion, so it's still stretching, pulling those tendons and stretching the muscles on the wrist. But you're going to feel less of it. And the analogy that I like to think of for that is that if you're doing a pull-up, you were holding yourself up, and then you relax to the ground, there'd still be a little bit of exertion of holding your arms up, but it's much more relaxed when you were holding your whole body in the air once you bring contact with the ground. So you start from here, and then you feel a slight relaxation, but still some tension there. Then what you're going to do is you're going to use I like to do the deviation alignment first, and that you do with the elbow displacement and the seesaw displacement. So that's this seesaw and elbow. And so you're going to feel this side, and you're just going to keep going and going until you don't feel tension on this side. Then what you want to do is you want to align the wrist flexion and extension, which is this up and down motion of the wrist. And so to do that, you're going to use the forearm contact point displacement, because if you keep contact with the strings, as you push forward, you're going to flex the wrist, and as you bring the contact point close to the wrist, you're going to tend to extend the wrist. And then the seesaw, which obviously in combination with gravity, whether you're staying in contact with the strings or not, is going to cause some wrist flexion and extension. So we align the deviation, and then we aligned with the seesaw and with the forearm contact point. The next exercise that I would do, now remember in the last video, we were going through the ranges of motion on their own, and we were doing a lot of extremes of the ranges of motion that were possible. And then gradually we were doing smaller and smaller amounts so that you could perceive smaller and smaller amounts of tension. The reason that we were doing that is when your alignment is coming from the right hand displacement types and gravity, the amount of tension is going to be a lot more subtle, especially once you've made contact with the strings. So we're basically going to do the same exercise we did before. We're going to do a lot of deviation towards the pinky, and then we're going to bring it back to its center. And then we're going to do smaller and smaller amounts and feel the tension and then feel it relax. Feel the tension, feel it relax. Feel the tension, feel it relax. Then you do the same thing with thumb deviation. Feel the tension, feel it relax. Feel the tension, feel it relax. Then you're going to do wrist flexion and extension, and you're going to use this one and the seesaw. And generally speaking, the seesaw, like once you get it set up, that's going to tend to be pretty good. But you can do both. So you can do seesaw, relax, seesaw, relax. And when you're doing the deviation, you want to feel this side and this side, and then the opposite, this side and this side. When you're doing the flexion and extension, I'd recommend feeling around the top here for extension and also around the fingers, because remember, the fingers get affected by the wrist movement. So feeling in the fingers is also going to help you as well. Like when I do flexion, I really feel a lot of it in the fingers. And so you're going to do really large motions of flexion and extension and deviation towards the pinky and thumb. And then gradually you're going to do smaller increments. So a little bit and then back to the center. A little bit, 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 back to the center. Now extension. A little bit, back to the center. Less, back to the center. Less, back to the center. Until you've trained yourself to use, and for the flexion again, I'd use both the seesaw and I'd use so really feel the fingers stretched with that forearm contact point shifting and back to the center. And then do smaller amounts, back to the center. Smaller amounts, back to the center. Smaller amounts, back to the center. Until you've trained yourself, just like we did the other day, to really feel all that. And then the last part of this is that once you've learned to get in contact with the center of the range of motion, you have to learn how to use some amount of wrist muscle to maintain that alignment. Now, the reason for that is because that once you go, sometimes when you're playing, you might have to go completely in the air. And you don't want, when you do that, for it to just flop all over the place and fall out. And also, as you move too, the wrist muscles holding it in place will do some amount of the work of keeping it aligned, even if you're like constantly staying in contact. Now, there's a couple ways to do that. One is that, and Rene talks about this a lot, he says you want to finger your piece in the right hand like it's walking, meaning that like there's always one foot on the ground as you walk. And so similarly, part of the way you can do this is sort of this coordination where the whole displacement type maintains the alignment of the wrist, and so you're kind of always in contact with the guitar and walking. The other option is to use anchor fingers. So what that means is you'll see like Lukas Krivopekowicz, or I forget what that dude's name is, but he's from Poland, and he'll use either the the ring finger to stay in contact with the guitar, or very often you'll see the thumb. And so like you'll see guys maintain a thumb in contact with the strings, and that helps you use some of the whole right hand displacement type to maintain that wrist alignment. But sometimes you can't use anchor fingers, and sometimes you can't finger your right hand like walking. The whole hand has to go in the air. And so the last part of this is training yourself. Basically, we went through all that work of learning how to train ourselves to align the wrist with the whole hand-arm complex, so that we could then just learn how to feel and bring it there with the wrist muscles and maintain that as we play. And that's like the meat and potatoes of this book. And I got to wrap this video up because the 11 o'clock alarm is about to go off. But thank you for your time, and that's basically the whole book, or the biggest part of it.